Welcome back to Swift Tale, the channel where real stories meet powerful lessons. If you're joining us for the very first time, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard a story so shocking, so unbelievable, that it completely shifts the way you view justice? If not, buckle up, because today's episode might do exactly that. And before we dive deeper into this emotional roller coaster, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us bring more stories like this to life. So, if you're new here, will you consider subscribing to be part of our growing community? In today's story, we step into a courtroom moment that left the entire nation talking. An incident involving the police chief's own son, an assault on a veteran who served this country with everything he had, and a courtroom decision by Judge Frank Caprio that stunned everyone who witnessed it. You may know Judge Caprio as the compassionate, fair, and thoughtful judge whose courtroom has become a symbol of humanity, but what he did in this case left both supporters and critics completely speechless. This story isn't just about conflict, it's about power, integrity, respect, and the question of whether justice truly applies equally to every person, no matter their background or connections. When a man who has worn this nation's uniform is assaulted by someone who grew up surrounded by law enforcement privilege, the situation becomes far more than a simple legal dispute. It becomes a test of the system, of accountability, and of the values we claim to stand for. Over the next chapters of this story, we'll explore what happened on that shocking day, the emotional testimony that followed, the pressure surrounding the courtroom, and the ruling that Judge Caprio delivered, one that would echo far beyond the court walls. Whether you've been watching Swift Tale since the beginning or you're just discovering us today, I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this case continues to stir conversations across the country. So grab your seat, settle in, and get ready, because the story you're about to hear isn't just dramatic, it's a reminder of what justice can look like when courage meets compassion. And remember, if you haven't already, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Let's begin. Judge Frank Caprio is not just a name on a courtroom door. He has become a symbol of compassion, fairness, and humanity in the justice system. Long before his courtroom clips went viral and turned him into a global figure of empathy, Caprio was a dedicated public servant who believed that justice should not only punish wrongdoing, but also uplift, understand, and restore. Born and raised in Providence, Rhode Island, he came from a humble background, the son of hard-working Italian immigrants who taught him the values of community, respect, and responsibility. These values would later shape his entire judicial philosophy, making him stand out from the traditional, rigid image of judges we often see. Throughout his decades-long career, Caprio built a reputation for listening, truly listening, to the people who stood before him. Whether someone was facing a parking ticket or a serious challenge in life, he approached every case with his signature blend of warmth and curiosity. He became known for asking people about their lives, their struggles, their families, and their hardships. To him, the courtroom wasn't a place to humiliate or overpower. It was a place where people could be heard, perhaps for the first time in their lives. This simple act of humanity resonated with millions, and it's why people across the world admire him not just as a judge, but as a moral leader. What makes Judge Caprio especially unique is his belief that justice cannot be separated from compassion. He's often said that every person who steps into a courtroom brings a story with them, one that deserves to be understood. This mindset led to countless unforgettable moments, where he forgave fines for struggling parents, encouraged students who had fallen off track, and comforted individuals who were dealing with personal tragedies. These weren't acts of leniency, they were acts of fairness, rooted in a deep understanding of human complexity. Caprio's courtroom became a place where the law met empathy, something rare and refreshing in a world where legal systems often feel cold and inflexible. His decisions were not based solely on black and white rules. They were guided by context, humanity, and the belief that people are capable of change. His approach earned him widespread respect among both ordinary citizens and legal professionals. Even those who disagreed with him acknowledged the sincerity behind his choices. This background is essential to understanding why the story you're about to hear is so powerful. When a case as emotionally charged as the assault on a veteran came before Judge Caprio, everyone wondered, how would a judge known for compassion respond when the stakes were high and the offender was connected to power? Would he maintain that same level of empathy? Would he bend under pressure? Or would he stand firm in his principles, even if it meant confronting influential figures? To appreciate the shockwaves his decisions sent through the community, you need to understand the man behind the bench, a judge who spent years proving that justice is not only about laws, but about heart. And what he did next, in this case, reinforces why so many people look to him as a beacon of integrity in a system that often feels distant and unforgiving. Before the assault, before the courtroom tension, and before Judge Caprio's shocking decision, there was a man whose life was defined by service, sacrifice, and quiet resilience. The veteran at the center of this story wasn't someone who sought attention or sympathy. He was the kind of American whose strength lived in the shadows, one of the countless men and women who returned from war carrying the invisible weight that the rest of the world rarely sees. His name, for privacy, isn't the focus here. What matters is the life he lived, the battles he fought, and the dignity he carried with him despite the hardships that followed him home. He served multiple years in the military, dedicating some of the best years of his life to defending his country. Those who knew him described him as humble, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. He didn't talk much about his experiences overseas, but when he did, there was a heaviness in his voice, a reminder that the service came with a cost. Like many veterans, he returned home changed. Some injuries healed, others didn't. There were days when simple tasks felt like mountains, nights when sleep refused to come, and moments when memories crept in uninvited. But he kept going, pushing forward with the quiet determination that had defined him for years. Life after service wasn't easy. He faced challenges that many veterans know all too well: financial stress, medical issues, and the struggle to adapt to civilian life. Sometimes he worked 2 jobs just to stay afloat. Other times, health problems forced him to rely on community programs or small benefits that never seemed enough. And yet, despite it all, he remained kind, polite, and respectful, a man who didn't complain, even when he had every reason to. He continued volunteering at local events, helping neighbors, and giving back to the very community he had once sworn to protect. People in the neighborhood admired him. Children waved when he walked by. Elders greeted him warmly. Store owners knew him by name and often said he had a good soul. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't powerful, but he carried himself with a quiet nobility that made others feel safe and seen. He represented the kind of everyday heroism that doesn't make headlines, but should. This is what makes the incident that happened to him so disturbing. A man who had risked his life for the freedoms of others, who had fought battles most of us will never understand, found himself disrespected, mistreated, and assaulted in a moment that should never have occurred. What happened wasn't just an attack on an individual, it was an attack on the very values he had spent years defending. And when the news spread, the community felt the sting as if it had happened to one of their own family members. To fully grasp the weight of this case, it's important to understand who this veteran was, not just a victim, but a man with a history of honor. His story is not just a backdrop, it's the heart of the emotional impact that shook the courtroom and left Judge Caprio visibly moved. The veteran wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't seeking attention. He simply wanted justice, not only for himself, but for what he represented. And that is why the courtroom fell silent when he finally stood up to speak. His words, shaped by years of pain and dignity, set the stage for one of the most powerful judicial moments that would follow. In every community, there are people who grow up in the shadow of authority, individuals who carry a name that opens doors, shifts conversations, and grants them the kind of unspoken privilege most people never experience. The police chief's son was one of those people. From the moment he was old enough to understand the weight of his father's badge, he also understood the influence that came with it. Teachers treated him with caution, local business owners greeted him with extra respect, and whenever trouble arose, there was always someone ready to smooth things over before it escalated. It was the kind of upbringing that shaped him, not entirely out of malice, but out of a lifetime of knowing that consequences rarely applied to him in the same way they applied to others. For years, he lived comfortably under that shield of protection. Some in the community whispered that he had a temper, that he could be arrogant, that he carried himself with an entitlement that didn't match his achievements. Others insisted He was simply misunderstood, a young man struggling to find his identity under the immense pressure of being the chief's son. But what almost everyone agreed on was that he often acted first and thought later, relying on the unspoken assumption that his father's status would clean up the mess. He had been involved in minor incidents before, nothing major enough to make headlines, but enough to raise eyebrows. Arguments at bars, disrespectful behavior at community events, and a few scuffles that mysteriously disappeared from official reports. People noticed, but few dared to question it. After all, who wants to challenge the most powerful law enforcement figure in town? And so the warnings went unspoken, the patterns went unaddressed, and the boundaries he should have learned as a child remained blurry well into adulthood. What made the situation tragic was not just the privilege he enjoyed, but how it molded his attitude towards others, especially those he viewed as weaker or less important. He wasn't known for empathy, he wasn't known for patience, and he certainly wasn't known for humility. His confidence, mixed with unchecked power, became a dangerous combination waiting for the wrong moment to explode. Unfortunately, that moment arrived the day he crossed paths with the veteran. To him, it was just another confrontation, just another chance to assert dominance, just another situation where he believed he could act without fear of consequences. But unlike his past missteps, this time the victim was someone the community deeply respected, a man who represented the very values the police force was supposed to uphold. And this time, the incident couldn't be swept under the rug. The line he crossed was too clear, too blatant, and too cruel to ignore. As word spread about what happened, even those who had long defended him struggled to justify his actions. Some tried to downplay it. Others blamed stress, alcohol, or immaturity. But deep down, many knew this wasn't a sudden mistake. It was the result of years of unchecked behavior, shaped by a lifetime of privilege and the comfort of knowing his father's position would always shield him. This background is essential to understanding the tension that followed. When the police chief's son walked into Judge Caprio's courtroom, he didn't enter as an ordinary defendant. He entered as a symbol of entitlement, power, and unequal justice. People wondered whether his father's title would influence the proceedings, whether the system would once again protect him, or whether, for the first time in his life, he would finally face accountability. Little did anyone know, the decision Judge Caprio was about to make would change everything. The day of the incident began like any other, quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. The veteran had gone about his routine, stopping by a small local store he often visited, the kind of place where the cashier knew his name and neighbors paused to chat. There was nothing unusual in his demeanor, nothing that hinted at the storm that was about to unfold. He was simply living another day in the slow, steady rhythm of his life. But sometimes, tragedy doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in the form of someone else's anger, someone else's ego, someone else's careless choice. The police chief's son entered the scene agitated, visibly worked up about something that had happened earlier. Witnesses later said he walked with the restless swagger of someone looking for a target, someone to redirect his frustration toward. His eyes landed on the veteran, who was quietly minding his own business. Maybe it was the way the veteran didn't look intimidated. Maybe it was the quiet dignity he carried himself with. Or maybe the chief's son simply wanted to assert his dominance in a space where he thought no one would challenge him, whatever the reason. The confrontation began with a spark, one sharp comment, one unnecessary jab, one attempt to provoke. The veteran, accustomed to far more dangerous situations, tried to de-escalate. He spoke calmly, didn't raise his voice, and attempted to walk away. But the police chief's son was not looking for peace. His insults grew louder, sharper, echoing through the small space. People watched nervously, unsure whether to step in. They knew who the aggressor was, they knew who his father was, and they knew that intervening could put them in an uncomfortable spotlight. But they also knew what the veteran represented to their community: courage, sacrifice, and unwavering respect. What happened next shocked everyone. In a burst of unchecked rage, the police chief's son pushed the veteran hard, causing him to stumble. When the veteran steadied himself and tried once more to walk away, the chief's son escalated further, shoving him again, this time with enough force to send him crashing to the ground. The room fell silent, a silence filled with disbelief and outrage. The veteran, a man who had survived war zones, found himself assaulted not by an enemy overseas, but by a privileged young man in his own hometown. Witnesses reported seeing fear flash across the veteran's face, not fear for his safety, but fear of what this moment represented, fear of humiliation, fear of being disrespected in front of the very community he had served, fear of a system that might once again fail someone like him. And when the police chief's son landed a final blow, one that left the veteran bruised and shaken, that fear turned into a deep, painful realization that even heroes are not immune to injustice. People finally intervened. A store employee rushed forward, followed by two customers who couldn't stand by any longer. They pulled the aggressor back as he kept shouting, trying to justify his outburst with excuses that fell apart the moment they left his mouth. The veteran, on the other hand, didn't lash out. He didn't fight back. He simply got up slowly, wiping the dust from his clothes with trembling hands, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and disappointment. When the authorities arrived, the air became even heavier. Officers recognized the chief's son instantly. Their expressions tightened, torn between their duty to uphold the law and the unspoken pressure that came with knowing the offender's family. The veteran said little. He didn't accuse, didn't exaggerate, didn't raise his voice. He simply told the truth, calmly, softly, powerfully. And as the officers took statements and reviewed the store's security footage, one thing became impossible to ignore. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mutual confrontation. This was an unprovoked assault on a respected member of the community. News of the incident spread quickly. By the time the day ended, people across the town were talking about what happened, some with anger, some with sadness, and many with a sense of disbelief that someone with so much privilege would attack someone who had sacrificed so much. The pressure on the police department grew instantly. The pressure on the chief himself was even greater. And as chatter grew louder, one question dominated every conversation. Would justice actually be served this time? That question would soon lead everyone, victims, witnesses, officers, and citizens, into Judge Caprio's courtroom, where the world would see whether fairness would prevail over influence. The incident didn't stay quiet for long. In fact, it spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, whispers turned into conversations, conversations turned into arguments, and arguments turned into a wave of anger that swept across the entire community. People who had known the veteran for years couldn't believe what they were hearing. The idea that a man who had risked his life for the safety and freedom of others had been assaulted, and by the police chief's son, no less, felt like a betrayal not just of him, but of the very values the town prided itself on. At first, the details were scattered, retold in bits and pieces by those who had been there. Some described the veteran's stunned silence. Others described the aggressor's reckless confidence. But the one detail that remained consistent in every retelling was the overwhelming sense of injustice. People were shocked not just by the violence itself, but by the imbalance between the two men. One, a decorated veteran who had always treated others with respect. The other, a young man who had been allowed to act without consequences for far too long. Social media amplified everything. Posts, photos, short clips of the aftermath, and emotional accounts from witnesses spread rapidly. Comments poured in hundreds, then thousands. Some expressed heartbreak, others expressed fury, many demanded accountability, and almost all agreed on one thing: enough was enough. The town had overlooked the chief's son's behavior for years. But this time, the wrongdoing was too blatant, too cruel, and too disrespectful to ignore. Veterans groups joined the conversation as well. People who had served alongside the victim, or who simply empathized with his struggle, voiced their outrage. They knew the sacrifices he had made. They understood the invisible battles he still fought. To see him treated with such disrespect by someone who had never experienced those hardships struck a deep, painful chord. Several veterans came forward publicly, stating that the assault felt like an attack on all of them. Even those who had once defended the police chief's son found themselves uncomfortable. Some tried to justify what happened, claiming it was just a heated moment or that the story was being blown out of proportion. But those voices faded quickly as more evidence surfaced, confirming that the assault was unprovoked and deliberate. Soon, silence settled over those who had once shielded him from consequences. Meanwhile, the police department found itself in an uncomfortable spotlight. Officers who had worked under the chief for years felt the weight of the community's scrutiny. People began asking hard questions. Why had past incidents been ignored? Why had warnings been swept aside? How many chances had this young man been given simply because of his father's title? Tensions grew not just between the public and the department, but within the department itself. Many officers respected the veteran deeply. Some had served in the military before joining the force. To see a fellow veteran treated that way and by someone protected by the system sparked anger even among the ranks. The police chief himself faced enormous pressure. Though he tried to remain neutral, the community expected him to speak out, to condemn the actions of his son, to show that no one was above the law, especially not those connected to the very institutions sworn to protect the community. The longer he remained silent, the more frustrated people became. What made the outrage so powerful wasn't just the violence, it was the symbolism behind it. To many, the assault represented a deep-rooted problem, the idea that privilege could tilt justice in one direction, leaving ordinary people, especially vulnerable ones, to fend for themselves. And when the victim was someone who had served his country, someone who had already given more than most people ever would, the pain ran even deeper. By the end of the week, the community had made its stance clear. They wanted fairness, they wanted accountability, and most of all, they wanted transparency. Rumors began circulating that the case would be brought before Judge Caprio, a name many respected for his fairness and compassion. People hoped he would bring clarity to a situation clouded by influence and emotion. And so, with tension still rising and anticipation building, the community waited. They watched, they talked, and they prepared themselves for whatever would unfold next in a courtroom where justice, for once, would face the ultimate test. As the community's outrage continued to grow, the legal system had no choice but to take action. There was too much evidence, too many witnesses, and far too much public pressure for this case to be quietly dismissed like the police chief's son's previous incidents. For the first time in years, he was facing consequences he couldn't outrun. And this time, the case was being assigned to someone who had no interest in bending under pressure, Judge Frank Caprio. The moment people heard the case had landed in Judge Caprio's courtroom, energy surged through the community. For some, it brought relief. Finally, a judge known for fairness and integrity would oversee the proceedings. For others, especially those who doubted the system, it brought nervous anticipation. Would Caprio be able to hold firm against the weight of the police chief's influence? Would the chief attempt to sway the outcome behind closed doors? Would justice actually prevail this time, or would connections and status twist the outcome once again? As the court date approached, the tension in the air felt almost physical. The courthouse staff sensed it, the officers stationed near the entrance sensed it, even the regular visitors, who often came to observe Caprio's compassionate rulings, sensed it. This wasn't just another case, it was a showdown between public trust and institutional power. Inside the courthouse, conversations echoed through hallways. Some officers expressed quiet concern, knowing Judge Caprio wouldn't tolerate manipulation. Others exchanged uneasy glances, aware that the chief's son was about to face a judge whose moral compass never wavered. The gravity of the moment seemed to settle over everyone like a heavy blanket. On the day of the hearing, the veteran arrived early. He walked slowly but steadily, dressed neatly, carrying himself with the same dignity he always had. There was no bitterness in his eyes, only a quiet determination. To him, this hearing wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about embarrassment or punishment. It was about truth. It was about being seen. It was about justice being honored, not because of who he was, but because of what was right. The police chief's son arrived shortly after, but his demeanor was much different. Gone was the arrogant swagger that witnesses had described. In its place was a nervous stiffness, a forced calmness that revealed the fear beneath the surface. He avoided eye contact with the people around him, especially with those who had supported his father for years. For the first time, he stepped into a courtroom not as the son of someone powerful, but as a defendant who might actually face accountability. The police chief himself kept a low profile, slipping in quietly and taking a seat away from the crowd. His face was unreadable, but his posture was tense. This wasn't just a legal matter for him, it was personal, political, and deeply humiliating. For years, He had protected his son from consequences, believing he was doing the right thing. But now, that protection had allowed his son's behavior to escalate into something far worse. And now, everyone would see the cost of ignoring the signs. When Judge Caprio finally entered the courtroom, silence fell instantly. His presence carried a weight unlike any other, calm, steady, authoritative, yet compassionate. He greeted the room with the warmth he was known for, but his eyes carried a seriousness that made it clear he understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a typical parking dispute or a hardship case. This was something deeper, something that touched the very heart of justice in the community. As the hearing began, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The evidence was presented. The testimonies were prepared. The tension was thick enough to feel. Everyone knew Judge Caprio's reputation, but no one knew what he would decide, not with stakes this high, not with emotions running this deep, and not with the pressure of a community watching so closely. What no one realized yet was that Caprio had already sensed something important, something that would shape the shocking decision he was about to make. And as the courtroom moved into the phase of testimonies and evidence, everyone braced themselves for a moment that would soon become one of the most talked-about decisions in his judicial career. The atmosphere inside Judge Caprio's courtroom grew heavier as the first witness was called. Every shifting chair, every whisper, every breath seemed amplified. It was the kind of silence that doesn't simply fill a room, it presses against it. The community had come to observe justice in motion, but what they didn't expect was how raw and emotional the testimonies would be. From the moment the veteran took the stand, it was clear the truth would not be delivered through anger or resentment, but through quiet dignity, dignity that spoke louder than any outburst ever could. The veteran's voice wavered slightly as he introduced himself, his years of service listed not with pride, but with humility. He didn't dramatize anything. He didn't embellish or accuse. Instead, he walked the court through the day of the assault step by step, describing every detail with the same steady discipline that had carried him through his years in the military. The courtroom listened as he explained how he had tried to de-escalate the situation, how he had attempted to walk away, and how the aggression persisted despite his efforts. It wasn't his words alone that moved the room. It was the way he held himself, shoulders back, voice soft, eyes firm, even when recounting the moment he hit the ground. Several jurors wiped their eyes discreetly. Even officers seated near the back shifted uncomfortably, clearly impacted by his calm bravery. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to forget this was a legal proceeding and saw instead the human cost of unchecked privilege. When the veteran finished speaking, Judge Caprio took a brief pause before addressing him, a pause that conveyed respect, understanding, and deep consideration. When the police chief's son was called to the stand, the contrast was stark. He approached hesitantly, the facade of confidence he once carried long gone. His voice trembled as he tried to explain himself. At first, he attempted to blame stress, frustration, a bad day, the same excuses people had heard from him before. But in front of Judge Caprio, excuses didn't hold the weight they used to. Caprio listened patiently, but with a stern expression, signaling that accountability, not deflection, was expected. The cross-examination was even more intense. Witnesses from the store confirmed the veteran's version of events. A young woman who had seen the entire altercation described how she had felt sick to her stomach, watching the veteran get shoved. Another witness explained how they rushed to intervene only after realizing the veteran wasn't going to defend himself, fearing the situation would escalate further. Each testimony added another layer, another piece of truth that painted a clear, undeniable picture of what had occurred. Then came the store's security footage, the moment everyone had been waiting for. As the video played on the monitor, the room fell completely silent. People watched as the police chief's son initiated the confrontation, watched the veteran attempt to disengage, watched the aggressive shoves, and finally, watched the veteran fall to the floor. The footage didn't just support the testimonies, it solidified them. There was no room left for speculation, no angle from which the assault could be interpreted as anything other than intentional. But what struck the room even more wasn't the physical violence, it was the expression on the veteran's face after he fell. The camera captured a moment of stunned disbelief, a moment of deep hurt, a moment that revealed more pain than any bruise ever could. It was the look of a man who had survived war only to be disrespected in the very community he had served. When the video ended, Judge Caprio leaned back, eyes lowered, absorbing everything. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak. This was no longer just a legal case, it was a test of values, a test of whether honesty and humanity would outweigh influence and entitlement. At the time Caprio signaled that the evidentiary phase had concluded, even the police chief seemed unable to hide his shame. His face was stiff, drained of the authority he usually projected. He knew, as did everyone in the room, that the evidence was overwhelming. And as the courtroom prepared for Caprio's next move, one question rose above all others. When the final piece of evidence had been reviewed and the courtroom settled into an uneasy stillness, all eyes turned to Judge Frank Caprio. He sat quietly for a long moment, hands folded, gaze fixed on the desk before him. To some, it looked like contemplation. To others, it looked like the weight of an entire community had just been placed on his shoulders. Everyone in the room understood that whatever he said next wouldn't just decide the fate of the police chief's son, it would send a message about what kind of justice system they lived under. When Caprio finally lifted his eyes, there was something different in them. It wasn't anger, though he clearly felt disturbed by what he had seen. It wasn't pity either, though his empathy was unmistakable. It was something deeper, something firm, unwavering, and profoundly principled. The courtroom sat in total silence as he began to speak. He started by addressing the veteran. His voice softened, carrying a level of respect that made the entire courtroom lean in. Caprio acknowledged the veteran's years of service, the sacrifices he had made, and the unfairness of what he had endured that day. He spoke not as a judge bound by formalities, but as a human being who recognized the pain another man had carried in silence. The veteran, who had remained composed throughout the hearing, lowered his head slightly, visibly moved by the judge's sincerity. Then Caprio turned his attention to the police chief's son. His tone shifted, not cruelly, not harshly, but with a clarity and firmness that cut sharper than any raised voice could. He spoke about accountability, about the dangers of entitlement, and about the responsibility one carries when they are connected to those who enforce the law. In that moment, it was clear Caprio saw beyond the young man's excuses. He saw a pattern, a history, and a mindset shaped by years of escaping consequences. What shocked the courtroom wasn't that Caprio condemned the behavior, it was how he did it. He didn't simply scold the defendant. He dismantled the idea that privilege should ever outweigh justice. He spoke openly about the failures that had led to this moment, not just the young man's failures, but the failures of those who had allowed him to believe he was untouchable. Several spectators glanced toward the police chief, whose face tightened with each word. Caprio's voice grew more solemn as he addressed the broader implications of the case. He talked about respect, respect for those who served, respect for fellow citizens, and respect for the law. He emphasized that when someone abuses their connection to power, they undermine the very foundation of justice itself. His words echoed through the courtroom, heavy and unforgettable. Then came the ruling. It wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't lenient, nor was it vindictive. Instead, it was incredibly intentional, crafted not only to punish, but to teach, to correct, and to force a reckoning. Caprio handed down a sentence that balanced accountability with the potential for transformation. It was a punishment the young man could not shrug off, not this time, and it carried a symbolic weight that told the community their trust had not been misplaced. But the real shock came from something else entirely, something unscripted, unplanned, and deeply human. After delivering the sentence, Caprio paused, then asked the young man to stand and look directly at the veteran. What followed was a moment so raw, so unexpected, that it brought several people in the audience to tears. Caprio demanded, not requested, that the police chief's son acknowledge the harm he had caused, not with rehearsed words, not with a forced apology, but with genuine recognition. For the first time in a long time, the young man's bravado crumbled. He struggled to speak, emotion breaking through the cracks in his voice. It was a moment of humility he had never experienced before, one that Caprio insisted on because accountability without compassion is empty, and compassion without accountability is meaningless. When the hearing ended, people didn't rush out of the courtroom. Many sat frozen, absorbing what they had witnessed. Some whispered that it was the most powerful moment they had ever seen in Judge Caprio's court. Others said it restored their faith in a justice system they had long questioned. Even officers who had walked in with uncertainty left with a renewed sense of duty and integrity. Judge Caprio didn't just rule on a case that day. He set a standard. He reminded everyone, powerful or ordinary, privileged or struggling, that justice is not a convenience. It is a commitment. And in that single courtroom on that single day, he proved that true justice still has a heartbeat. As the courtroom emptied and the echoes of Judge Caprio's words lingered in the air, one truth became undeniable. Justice is most powerful when it balances accountability with compassion. This case was not just about an assault or a privileged individual misusing his status. It was about a community witnessing fairness in action, about a veteran finally being recognized and respected, and about a young man being confronted with the consequences of his actions in a way that demanded reflection and growth. For those of us observing, it was a powerful reminder that integrity, empathy, and courage are not just ideals. They are necessary pillars for any society that hopes to uphold justice. The reactions following the ruling tell their own story. People in the community spoke of renewed faith in the system, while others recognized the importance of acknowledging wrongdoing rather than hiding behind privilege. Judge Caprio's approach, firm yet humane, reminded us all that the law is not a tool for retaliation, nor is it a shield for the powerful. It is a framework designed to uphold fairness, dignity, and accountability for everyone, regardless of status or influence. It was a moment that inspired not just awe, but reflection. How we treat others, the way power is exercised, and the responsibility we have to ensure justice is served for all, not just the few. For you watching, this story carries a deeper message. It encourages us to speak up against wrongdoing, to honor those who serve selflessly, and to hold accountable those who think they are above the law. It also reminds us of the value of empathy in justice, the ability to recognize human complexity while ensuring consequences are clear. Judge Caprio's courtroom became more than a legal space that day. It became a stage where morality, courage, and fairness converged in a way that left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. At Swifttail, we share stories like this to not just inform, but to inspire. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you reflect, there are a few simple things you can do to support the channel. Like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe for more content that dives deep into stories of justice, courage, and human resilience. We also want to hear from you. What did you think of Judge Caprio's handling of the case? How do you believe justice should balance accountability and compassion? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and your voice is part of this ongoing conversation about fairness and integrity in our society. In the end, this story reminds us that actions have consequences, power must be checked, and true justice is never blind. It sees, listens, and acts with both strength and humanity. And that is the kind of story that keeps us engaged, enlightened, and inspired to be better, both in our communities and in ourselves. The courtroom drama didn't end when the gavel came down. Outside, the police chief's son returned home to a reality he had rarely experienced: reflection, judgment, and consequence. For years, he had navigated life under the protection of his father's status, shielded from accountability, and able to act without fear of lasting repercussions. But now, the court's decision and the weight of public scrutiny forced him to confront the repercussions of his actions. The once confident swagger was replaced by nervous tension, awkward apologies, and the crushing understanding that privilege could no longer excuse reckless behavior. Family dynamics shifted almost immediately. The police chief, long accustomed to defending his son, faced an uncomfortable reckoning of his own. He had to acknowledge publicly that his protection and indulgence had contributed to the escalation of events. Inside the home, conversations were no longer dominated by pride or status. Instead, they were heavy with reflection, disappointment, and the difficult lessons that come from seeing a loved one held accountable. Siblings and extended family members grappled with divided loyalties, some wanting to defend the young man, others pushing for acknowledgement and change. The young man's social circles were also affected. Friends who once admired him for his family connections began questioning their loyalty. Some distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with behavior that had not only hurt another person, but shaken the reputation of their entire community. Slowly, he faced the isolation that comes from realizing that relationships built on influence rather than genuine respect cannot survive when accountability arrives. Meanwhile, community members watched closely, observing whether the lessons of this case would take hold. Many hoped that the experience would prompt genuine personal growth, a reckoning that went beyond legal punishment to touch the deeper attitudes that had allowed entitlement to flourish unchecked. The young man's journey after the trial became a public story in its own right, a reminder that actions have lasting effects not only on victims, but on perpetrators, families, and communities as a whole. Most importantly, this section of the story underscores a vital theme. Justice doesn't end at the courtroom door. True accountability extends into everyday life, into relationships, into self-awareness. The police chief's son had to face not only legal consequences, but the difficult, often painful process of recognizing the harm he had caused and taking steps, public and private, to make amends. And while change is never guaranteed, this moment became a turning point, forcing him to confront a truth that he could no longer ignore. Privilege cannot shield a person from the moral weight of their actions. In the weeks following the court's ruling, the town began a slow process of healing. For a community that had been shaken by the assault, the trial and Judge Caprio's decision served as both a moment of reckoning and a catalyst for reflection. Local residents organized discussions, gatherings, and support networks for veterans and others affected by the incident. It wasn't just about the young man's punishment. It was about restoring trust, ensuring accountability, and reaffirming the values that held the community together. People began sharing their own stories, their experiences of unfairness, and their hopes for a more just society. The veteran became a symbol of dignity and resilience, not only for surviving the assault, but for showing how calm courage could confront injustice. Local organizations held appreciation events, community members wrote letters of gratitude, and even neighbors who had once been indifferent found themselves moved to speak out in support. The act of coming together reminded everyone that justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It is reinforced through recognition, support, and collective reflection. At the same time, dialogue with the police chief's family, though tense, played a role in reconciliation. The son's public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, guided by the court, opened the door for honest conversations about responsibility and privilege. While forgiveness was not immediate or universal, the town recognized the importance of allowing for accountability paired with growth. These steps, small, deliberate, and difficult, laid the foundation for a stronger, more conscientious community. In many ways, the incident became a turning point. Schools and local organizations began workshops about respect, accountability, and conflict resolution, using the case as a teachable moment. Citizens discussed ways to ensure that no one in the community felt above the law, and leaders emphasized the importance of transparency and empathy. Through the pain and anger, the town slowly began to rebuild trust, turning a moment of injustice into a lesson in resilience, morality, and the power of collective responsibility. This period of reconciliation underscored a key lesson. While individual actions may cause harm, communities have the capacity to respond with strength, reflection, and a commitment to doing better. The assault on the veteran was a dark moment, but it sparked a brighter awareness of fairness, accountability, and the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is uncomfortable. Once the trial concluded and Judge Caprio's ruling made headlines, the story quickly spread beyond the town, capturing national attention. News outlets dissected every detail: the assault, the victim's service, the police chief's son's privileged background, and of course, the judge's firm yet compassionate handling of the case. Commentators debated the implications, highlighting the tension between power and accountability, privilege and justice, and how a single act could ripple across a community and even a nation. Social media amplified these discussions, with hashtags trending and citizens sharing their own reflections, outrage, and support for the veteran. Public opinion was divided, yet the overwhelming response leaned toward admiration for Judge Caprio's approach. Many viewers praised his insistence on accountability paired with moral guidance, noting how rare it was for a courtroom to combine justice with empathy so effectively. The veteran's dignity in facing the assault also became a talking point, as people admired his restraint, courage, and refusal to escalate violence despite provocation. Meanwhile, conversations about the responsibilities of parents, authority figures, and community leaders became central, as people debated how society shapes young people's behavior and the consequences of failing to intervene early. Beyond the immediate drama, the case sparked deeper societal reflection. It became a lens for examining systemic privilege, the role of influence in legal proceedings, and the ethical obligations of those in power. Schools, universities, and civic organizations began hosting panels and discussions using the incident as a case study. Topics ranged from accountability and ethical leadership to the importance of standing up for victims, regardless of the aggressor's background. Across the country, this single local incident inspired broader awareness about fairness, equity, and the courage needed to confront wrongdoing. For many, the story served as a wake-up call. Justice is not abstract. It's personal, tangible, and shaped by the choices individuals and communities make every day. It reminded people that no one should feel above the law and that true integrity requires both enforcement and moral courage. The narrative of the assault, the courtroom, and Judge Caprio's ruling became more than a news story. It became a symbol of hope that even in difficult circumstances, fairness and accountability could prevail when courage, transparency, and human decency aligned. In the months following the trial, the ripple effects of the incident continued to shape the town and its institutions. Local authorities, under pressure from the community and public scrutiny, began implementing reforms aimed at preventing similar abuses of privilege. Policies were updated, training programs introduced, and oversight mechanisms strengthened to ensure that influence and status could no longer shield anyone from accountability. The police department, in particular, focused on emphasizing ethics, de-escalation, and respect for all citizens, highlighting the lessons learned from the case of the chief's son. Community organizations also stepped up. Veteran support groups gained new attention, funding, and membership as people recognized the importance of standing by those who had served selflessly. Schools incorporated discussions about respect, conflict resolution, and ethical decision-making into their curricula, using the incident as a real-world example of the consequences of unchecked behavior. Parents and mentors were encouraged to teach responsibility, empathy, and the importance of owning one's actions early, reinforcing that no one is above the law or above moral accountability. The young man himself began a difficult, ongoing journey of self-reflection and rehabilitation. While some doubted whether he could change, the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, combined with the structured consequences, created an opportunity for growth. Counseling, mentorship, and community service became part of his rehabilitation, offering a path toward understanding the gravity of his actions and learning the value of humility and responsibility. Perhaps the most lasting impact, however, was the cultural shift within the town. People started speaking openly about justice, privilege, and fairness in ways they had avoided before. Citizens felt empowered to challenge wrongdoing and support victims, and leaders recognized the importance of transparency, integrity, and moral courage. The incident, though painful, became a turning point, a reminder that even in communities with entrenched influence and inequality, accountability, empathy, and vigilance could restore trust and foster lasting positive change. Ultimately, this chapter of the story demonstrated that lessons from one incident could reshape not just individuals, but entire systems, proving that justice is not only about punishment, but about creating a framework where respect, fairness, and responsibility are embedded into everyday life. As the story comes to a close, it's clear that the events surrounding the assault, the courtroom drama, and Judge Caprio's ruling are more than just an isolated incident. They are a mirror reflecting the values, flaws, and potential of an entire community. The veteran's courage, the police chief's son's reckoning, and the judge's firm yet compassionate decision highlight the complex interplay between accountability, privilege, and moral responsibility. This narrative reminds us that justice is not abstract or automatic. It requires vigilance, empathy, and courage from individuals and institutions alike. The long-term impact of this case reaches far beyond the courtroom. It sparked meaningful conversations, inspired reforms, and prompted community-wide reflection on fairness, respect, and ethical behavior. People were reminded that every action has consequences and that privilege does not excuse wrongdoing. Leaders, families, and individuals alike were challenged to consider their role in fostering accountability and empathy within their circles. The story demonstrates that even painful events can become catalysts for growth, teaching lessons that resonate for years to come. For the audience here at Swift Tale, the key takeaway is simple. Stories like this matter because they hold up a mirror to our society, our choices, and our values. Justice is a shared responsibility, and when we confront wrongdoing with courage and integrity, we not only protect victims, we strengthen the moral fabric of our communities. If this story resonated with you, here's how you can take part in this ongoing conversation. Like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Swift Tale for more stories that explore justice, courage, and human resilience. Don't forget to comment below with your thoughts. How do you define accountability? How should communities respond when privilege clashes with justice? Your perspective matters and can spark meaningful dialogue. In the end, this story is a reminder that justice, empathy, and integrity are not just ideals, they are practices that shape real lives. The veteran's dignity, the court's fairness, and the lessons learned from the police chief's son all leave a lasting impression. True justice sees the truth, holds people accountable, and inspires communities to do better. And that is the kind of story that keeps us reflecting, learning, and striving to be better every day.